How's it going, guys? I'm Matt Torix, and if it wasn't obvious by now, I love the Fallout series. So much in fact that over the course of the past 2 months, I took the time to play and review every game in the franchise. From the major successes to the unknown failures, and naturally after playing each and every game, I started to form my own opinions on how each and every one stacks up against one another, which are the best and the worst. So in order to send this series off with a bang, today we are ranking every Fallout game on a tier list in a chronological order, once and for all. Now before we start, I should say that these are all my opinions, so don't take anything I say too personally. But without any further ado, let's get into today's video. Now starting things off strong with the game that started it all, Fallout, which I'm choosing to rank at a solid A tier. Now I never played the original Fallout before this series, so my experience playing this was honestly a pretty unique one. By playing this game, I got to understand the roots of the series, and how all of the ideas that came from my favorite Fallouts originated from this one game. And just by the time I've spent playing it, in my free time since that video, I can tell all the love and passion that was originally put into it, which is the thing that you can almost seldom see in a game nowadays. The story is great, and there's so many small details that make sure to account for almost any situation the player wants to do, making it a true role-playing experience. But that being said, there are some things holding it back from that coveted S spot. To start, the game being the first in the series naturally means that it's going to be a little bare bones when it comes to features and content, since games that came after it expanded and sometimes improved on the formula that had already been created, and the controls, although making sense for the time based on hardware restrictions, can definitely provide a steep learning curve for people trying to pick up the game. Finally, in a series like this that has just so many good games, the S tier just gets that higher barrier to entry that I think Fallout falls just shy of. But speaking of S tier, the next game on this list, Fallout 2, is a perfect example of what S tier looks like. Building upon the Fallout formula in almost every way possible, and delivering a truly great experience. So many factors that made Fallout unique were cranked up to 10, as the developers by this point knew what people wanted. To start out, the story and comedy were vastly improved. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Master and his plot of the Super Mutants was good, but the Master pales in comparison to the beast known as Frank Horrigan. Everything about this dude makes him a memorable antagonist, from his imposing size to his unwavering loyalty to his creed, and it makes him that much more influential. The ambience and voice acting of this game are also improved, which contributes to the overall feel and flow of the story, making it feel more real and engaging. The controls, while mostly the same as the original, feel a bit more in-depth and user-friendly than the first, and lastly it just has more content than Fallout. A perfect example of a sequel doing everything right. Next up, and the first example of the Fallout franchise doing a wild experiment to expand the brand, Fallout Tactics. Now for me, this game hits a perfect middle-of-the-road feel, so I'm giving it a C, since I feel it does some things really well, and others really poorly. When it comes to its take on the 2D overhead gameplay, it makes sure to add depth to the combat and strategy, and use the point-and-click style in a way that is miles better than the first two. The game has you command a squadron of soldiers rather than a single character, unlike any other installment, which both helps and hinders the game in my opinion, as it adds to the strategy of battle and fighting, but it also makes the story suffer as you control a team of always changing members and never learn about anybody on your team. And the gimmick of real-life strategy tactics feels unfinished and niche most of the time. But the lack of role-playing is actually what holds this game back the most out of any complaint, as these games did start out as RPGs after all. And unfortunately, this game was kind of put at the exact wrong point in the series, since it lacks the aforementioned story of previous games, as well as improved gameplay of any means. Not a terrible game, but not great, so C tier is what I feel is a good fit. And speaking of terrible games, next up we have Brotherhood of Steel, D tier. Now if you watch my video on this game, you know that I hated it. It was just one of those types of media where you look at it and say, how is this supposed to be Fallout? The game is a top-down dungeon crawler that has you chasing after a lost squadron of Brotherhood of Steel soldiers. And so many things that make a Fallout game so iconic and easily recognizable are either altered completely or just flat-out missing. For starters, there is zero character creation or role-playing elements. You rarely speak to NPCs, and when you do, they have almost nothing to say. No character creation, no old-timey swing music that had been present in previous titles. Not to mention it was only ever released on consoles and never on any computer systems. If you want a more in-depth look at Brotherhood of Steel, there should be a link popping up in the top right for my video covering the game. Overall, this game was a big stinker in an otherwise good franchise. But moving on to the Bethesda era, we start with Fallout 3, and I'm sliding that one straight into a solid B tier. Now, there are a lot of things about the game that I like. The new gameplay and the depth it adds, the emphasis on looting and gear, the unique characters, the ability to keep the style of 2D games in a 3D world, and of course, the updated budget and graphics that would come to be expected and loved from the franchise. But that being said, there are a few things that keep it from being A tier on this list. Now, I've always been a fan of role-playing in these types of games, and I love when your games leave the story or background of your character vague or unknown. It allows you to decide who and what your character is going to be from the moment it starts. Now, the first two games do a really good job of this, as once you leave Vault 13 or Arroyo, you're pretty much free to do whatever. And the character acts more as a lens to see the world of Fallout through, rather than a protagonist. But in Fallout 3, the Lone Wanderer has more ties and pre-existing lore in the world around them through characters like Father, making it so the story feels more restrictive and linear, which is fine for games with a set protagonist, but in games with character creation and no set protagonist, it can take away from the story and make you feel fenced in. But besides that, the game isn't the smoothest or easiest to run, and some of the things it does best get done better by the next game on this list, New Vegas. Now, it should be no surprise to anybody watching that Fallout New Vegas gets the easiest S tier of this video. I mean, so many things that this game has going for it just click together in the perfect way. It kinda has the opposite problem of Tactics, as it was made with the fully updated gameplay of Fallout 3, while still retaining the sense of world building and story from the classics. And specifically when it comes to story, I think New Vegas takes the perfect approach. Like I mentioned with Fallout 3, I think stories in RPGs like Fallout work the best when the character you play as doesn't really have any ties to the world around them, making it so that we the player can see the world through our character, and act how we see fit. And New Vegas does this perfectly, as the Courier has almost no pre-existing background, allowing us to properly view the struggle of the Mojave from an unbiased point of view, and decide its fate for ourselves. It also has some of my favorite and most in-depth characters of the series. People like Mr. House, and even Caesar to a certain extent, act as perfect examples of flawed villains that have reasoning behind their evil and motives, making the game feel real and unsettling with their unique behaviors. I could go on, but since so many people on the internet sing this game's praises, I'll end it here for now and move on to the next game. That game being the one and only Fallout Shelter, which unfortunately has to go in D tier. Now, as a mobile game, I think Fallout Shelter is pretty good. It doesn't jam microtransactions down your throat as often as others, has a decent gameplay loop, and some cool references to other games in the series. But since I'm comparing Fallout games and not mobile games, I have to look at it in the context of that. And compared to almost any other game on this list, it doesn't have enough going for it to stack up against anything else. I don't really have much more I can say about it since there's not much to talk about, but I think within the context, D tier is a fair ranking. Next up is what I think is going to be one of my most controversial takes on this list. I am putting Fallout 4 in A tier. Now, most lists I see put 3 above 4, which I can totally understand, but I think if you remove the nostalgia factor from Fallout 3, 4 does what it is trying to do, but better. Both of these games have the goal of sacrificing role-playing in order to tell the story exactly how they want to do it. They also both aimed at the time to revolutionize the franchise and update it for a new audience, which makes them very similar. And due to the time difference between these two, Fallout 4 gets more of that chance to do so, as its gunplay and mechanics are that much better, making the game funner to me overall. Its weakest part is its lackluster story when compared to the top 3 on this list, but that same issue is present in Fallout 3, which makes them tied in that regard. So to me, Fallout 4 is the better game, purely because of that better gameplay. Moving on to the final game of this list, and one that disappointed me the most, Fallout 76. Now, this game is the most recent in my head, coming off my series, and I had some certain hopes for it, but I have to go D tier. I really wish that this game could have felt different to me than it did at first launch, since back then it was pretty much hated by everybody. So I was really hoping that coming back to it 6 years later would make me so surprised at how different the game felt and played. But when I booted it up recently, I couldn't help but notice that it still felt empty and boring. Now, don't get me wrong, it definitely had that fresh coat of paint, but amongst that shine, the cracks and scars of what once were still visible. And I just can't really ever see myself playing this game over 90% of Fallout games available. And after a bit of shuffling, this is the final order of my tier list. Now, like I said, if you feel like disagreeing with me, feel free to do so in the comments below. But in addition, you can also find a template of the tier list in the description of this video, and tweet it to me on my Twitter. The handle should be on screen now, as well as a link in the description. But with that, guys, that is all for today. If you got this far, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.